The rain had started long before the city awoke. It was the kind of relentless downpour that seemed to wash away time itself, erasing footsteps, muting sounds, and blurring everything into a gray, trembling haze. Beneath a bench at the edge of Riverside Park, curled into himself like a frightened animal, lay a man who had long learned how to be invisible. His back was hunched, his face buried under a faded hood, and his body wrapped in a weather-beaten army coat that had seen more winters than most could endure. His boots were torn at the seams. One of the laces had been replaced with a twisted strip of plastic. He was still, but not asleep. Veterans rarely sleep in public, not fully. Not when the world has shown them how quickly peace turns to threat. Daniel Cole had not spoken to anyone in 2 days. Not because he could not, but because there was simply no reason to. Words had long since lost their value. When you are homeless, people either avoid you, pity you, or bark at you to move. No one waits to hear your story. No one leans in to ask your name. Silence had become his ally. It was better to be quiet than misunderstood, better to go unnoticed than judged. His body ached. Every joint ached like rusted steel. The cold soaked deep into his bones. He had eaten only half a granola bar the day before, and the night had offered little shelter. The storm had started just after midnight. Daniel had taken refuge beneath the park bench after the bus terminal security forced him to leave. He had been at the station to charge his phone, not to sleep, but rules were rules. Still, something else had happened there. Something no one cared to ask about. That morning he had been walking past the terminal restroom when he heard a muffled scream. Inside, a young girl, no older than 15, was being cornered by a man twice her size. She was crying, her backpack on the floor, one strap ripped. Daniel reacted without hesitation. He did not think. Training kicked in. Years of discipline did not vanish just because he had fallen through society's cracks. He stepped in, grabbed the man by the jacket, and dragged him away. A struggle broke out. The man hit him in the face. Daniel struck back and pushed him into a sink. The commotion drew security, but by then the girl had run off, too frightened to explain, and the man, a known petty offender, claimed Daniel had attacked him without provocation. When the officers arrived, they took statements, but no one bothered asking Daniel what had happened. He tried to speak, but one of the guards shouted, "Keep your mouth shut, you stinking drunk." That was all it took. They handcuffed him and booked him for trespassing and resisting. The other man walked free. It was not uncommon. People like Daniel, men with matted hair and ragged coats, fit a narrative that no one questions anymore. And so, for the third time in 5 years, Daniel Cole was taken into custody. The patrol car was quiet as it drove through the wet streets. Daniel stared out the window, watching the city blur behind the rain. He thought about nothing, or maybe he thought about everything all at once. The rain, the girl's frightened eyes, the angry officer, the sink cracking behind that man's back, the shame. The shame was worse than the pain. He knew he had done the right thing, but right and wrong rarely mattered anymore. Not when you looked the way he did. At the station he was booked, fingerprinted, and placed in a holding cell. The bench was metal, cold. The food was stale, a slice of bread with a smear of peanut butter. He ate slowly, without appetite. He spoke to no one. A few other inmates sat across the cell, laughing loudly at some story. One of them glanced at Daniel and whispered something to the others. They snickered, but Daniel did not respond. He had grown used to that. People saw what they wanted, a broken man. Not the soldier who had once carried his wounded lieutenant through a battlefield under fire. Not the father who had written bedtime stories on napkins during deployments. Not the husband who had once held his wife's trembling hand as she went through chemo. All of that was gone now. Grief had changed him. Poverty had sealed the change. 3 days passed in the cell. No one came. Not a call, not a lawyer, just silence. Every hour blurred into the next. A clock ticked faintly on the wall, reminding him of time's slow torture. He remembered his daughter. What was her name again? Jessica. Yes, she would be 26 now. He wondered where she was, if she was safe, if she even remembered him. He had stopped writing her years ago after his third letter came back unopened. Maybe it was for the best. On the third night, he woke up from a nightmare, breathing heavily, heart pounding like a drum in his ears. In the dream, he was back in Fallujah. Smoke everywhere. A comrade's voice screaming through the radio. He could feel the heat, the shrapnel, the ringing in his ears. But then it faded. He sat upright and placed his hands over his face. Just another dream. Just another night. He had lived this way for years. It never got easier. The next morning, a deputy approached the cell with keys in hand. Cole. Daniel Cole, the deputy said gruffly. Daniel stood slowly. His knees cracked as he rose. The deputy opened the cell door and gestured. Court date. Let's go. Daniel followed silently. His feet dragged slightly, his boots soaking wet from the previous day. As he was escorted down the corridor, other inmates shouted behind him. Some laughed. One man howled like a wolf. Another coughed violently. But Daniel kept his eyes forward. He was led into a small room where a public defender sat waiting. A young woman no older than 30, with a briefcase and a tired expression. She glanced up from her file. "You're Mr. Cole?" He nodded once. She sighed, flipping through papers. Charged with trespassing and resisting. No prior felony. No address. No listed employment. They're pushing for 90 days, possibly. More if you do not plead out. Judge Royce is hearing your case. She is strict but fair. Do you have anything to say? Daniel remained quiet. The woman looked up. Mr. Cole? He took a slow breath and spoke for the first time in days. His voice was rough, deep like a man who had swallowed dust and gunpowder for most of his life. There was a girl. She was in danger. I stopped him. The attorney blinked, caught off guard by the calm sincerity in his voice. She looked down, again, then said, "There's no mention of any girl in the report." "I did not know her name," Daniel replied. The lawyer hesitated. "Well, I will mention it to the judge, but unless the girl comes forward, it will not help." Daniel said nothing more. He knew how this worked. Justice was not always about truth. It was about evidence, and sometimes even the truth needed a witness. He was led into the courtroom just after noon. The room smelled of polish and paper. Rows of pew-like benches lined the gallery. A few spectators sat scattered throughout, mostly people waiting their turn. Daniel was guided to the defendant's table. His public defender stood beside him. He kept his eyes down. Then, the bailiff stood. All rise. The Honorable Judge Marilyn Royce presiding. The courtroom stood. The doors opened. And from that moment forward, everything would change. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open with a faint creak, followed by the unmistakable echo of a gavel tapping once. Firm, deliberate, final. A hush rippled through the room. Every seat creaked as people rose from the gallery benches. Even the restless shuffling of papers ceased. In that moment, all eyes turned toward the raised platform at the front of the room where justice lived, where it ruled quietly, and without compromise. The bailiff, standing rigidly near the bench, called out with authority, "All rise, the Honorable Judge Marilyn Royce presiding." She entered briskly, robes trailing behind her, her posture tall and unbending. She was a woman in her early 60s with iron-gray hair tied in a low bun, sharp eyes that had seen the full spectrum of human nature, and a face shaped by decades of holding men and women accountable. Though the courtroom saw her nearly every day, she never blended into routine. Her presence brought tension. Some feared her, others respected her, but no one ever ignored her. Judge Royce reached the bench, placed her hands flat on the polished wood, and took a slow breath. Her gaze swept across the courtroom, the prosecutor, the clerk, the public defender's table, before it landed on the defendant. Her eyes lingered there, and something subtle changed in her face. She was not just studying the man. She was trying to remember something. Her fingers paused mid-motion as she reached for her glasses, but instead of slipping them on, she simply stared. The man standing silently beside the public defender was older than most defendants she saw. His beard was graying unevenly, his skin tanned from long exposure to the sun, and his shoulders slumped not from shame, but from the weight of a long and complicated life. His coat, clearly military issue, was worn at the edges and water-stained. He held his hands clasped in front of him as if he had long given up the need to defend himself. He stood still, silent, waiting. It was the kind of posture a man develops only after years of standing in line, in service, in shadows. The bailiff began the docket call. Case number 23 to 1087, People of the State versus Daniel Cole, charges, trespassing, obstruction of authority, and resisting arrest. Judge Royce did not immediately respond. Her eyes remained on the defendant. There was an expression on her face that was hard to read. Part suspicion, part curiosity, and something else. Something deeper. Then she leaned slightly forward and spoke. Not loudly, but clearly. "Mr. Cole, please state your name for the record." The room waited. Daniel lifted his eyes. He had not spoken since arriving in the courtroom. He had kept his gaze low, but now he looked up. Not in defiance and not with pleading, just a quiet dignity that refused to die. He spoke slowly, voice husky but firm. "Daniel Cole, ma'am." And the courtroom froze. It was not just the words. It was the way he said them. The name itself, Daniel Cole, meant nothing to most in the room, but to one person, it meant everything. Judge Royce inhaled sharply. Her fingers curled slightly against the bench. Her posture changed, her jaw tightened. Not with anger, but with memory. She took a step back and lowered herself into her chair, though her eyes never left his face. A silence followed, longer than procedural, heavier than formality. The air felt denser somehow. Even the clerk, mid-type, paused and looked up. The judge sat forward slightly as if trying to get a clearer look. She tilted her head, her voice noticeably softer now. "Your full name, sir, and your service history, if you please." The public defender looked up confused, glancing from her client to the judge. Daniel blinked slowly. "Sergeant Daniel Allen Cole, United States Army, retired. Echo Company, 3rd Battalion, Iraq, Afghanistan, 1990 through 2007. The moment he said Echo Company, something seemed to shift inside Judge Royce. Her eyes welled up just slightly, and she leaned back in her chair. A memory returned to her like a lightning strike on a clear day. She pressed her lips together and slowly removed her glasses. She whispered almost to herself, "Echo Company. Basra, 1991. The courtroom had no idea what was happening, but everyone sensed the emotional weight behind her tone. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. Even the bailiff turned slightly toward the bench, visibly puzzled. Daniel said nothing more. He stood still, waiting, unsure why the judge suddenly looked like she had seen a ghost from another lifetime. Judge Royce cleared her throat and addressed the room, voice still firm but less cold. "Will counsel approach the bench, please?" The attorneys obeyed immediately, walking to the bench where she lowered her voice. The microphones did not catch her words, but those close by could see her mouth a few unmistakable phrases. "Find out everything you can about this man's military record, quietly. I want confirmation before we proceed." The public defender nodded, her eyes wide. The prosecutor hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden change in atmosphere, but he said nothing. After a brief pause, the judge turned back to Daniel. She studied him again, but this time her expression had softened. It was no longer suspicion or authority that filled her eyes. It was familiarity, recognition, even reverence. "Mr. Cole," she began, "do you recall a convoy incident in March of 1991? Near a small village outside Basra?" Daniel nodded once. "Yes, ma'am. We were ambushed on a dirt road. I was part of the rear guard." She exhaled, a hand briefly rising to cover her mouth. "My brother was in that convoy, Lieutenant Harold Royce. He died that night. But he wrote a letter just a few days before, mentioning a Sergeant Cole, said he owed his life to you after an earlier skirmish. Said if he did not make it back home, he wanted us to know the kind of man you were." Daniel's eyes blinked slowly, and for the first time in the entire process, emotion broke through the barrier he had carefully constructed. He looked down for a moment, jaw tightening. "I remember him. He gave his ration pack to a kid who had lost his parents. He was the kind of officer men would actually follow. Good man." The judge closed her eyes for a moment, overwhelmed. "He always spoke about you with such admiration. That letter, I still have it. Folded, worn out, in the top drawer of my desk. I was only 28 when he died. It took our family years to accept it." For a long pause, neither of them said anything. The courtroom remained in complete silence. Then Judge Royce looked around and said, "I want a recess. 10 minutes. I need a moment." She stood from the bench, and once again the courtroom rose instinctively. But this time, it felt different. They were not rising for protocol. They were rising in response to something they did not yet fully understand. Something powerful had shifted in that room. A quiet man in a soaked military coat had walked in as another statistic. But now, people looked at him differently. As the judge exited through the side door, Daniel turned toward the bench where he had stood just moments earlier. The light from a high window now hit his face. The rain outside had stopped, and for the first time in years he felt seen. He sat back down at the defense table. The public defender leaned toward him and whispered, "What just happened?" Daniel gave a faint shrug. "I do not know. I was just telling the truth." The bailiff remained standing at the corner of the room, still staring at him, still visibly stunned. The prosecutor flipped through the file again as if something new might suddenly appear, but the truth had already walked into the room, and it had spoken for itself. The courtroom remained wrapped in silence, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. When Judge Royce returned from recess, she looked more composed, but there was a softness to her that had not been there before, a quiet war between her judicial duty and deeply personal memory. She took her seat slowly, not as a figure of unquestioned power, but as a woman who had just come face to face with history. She leaned toward the microphone and cleared her throat gently, her voice even but emotionally weighted. "Mr. Cole," she said, locking eyes with him again. "Before we move forward, I need to ask you something. Not for the record, not as a judge, but as a sister. Are you the same Daniel Cole who served in Echo Company? Deployed during Operation Desert Storm in 1991? Daniel nodded once, unblinking. Yes, ma'am. I was a sergeant then. Her hands folded tightly in front of her, knuckles paling from the pressure. Then you knew Lieutenant Harold Royce? A long, pained silence followed before Daniel replied. Yes, I did. He was our commanding officer in that sector for a short time. Brave man. Took risks for his men he did not have to. She breathed in slowly as if absorbing every word. He mentioned you in his letters, said that if anything ever happened to him, someone named Sergeant Cole would know how he lived. Said you saved lives the week before he died. Daniel's eyes lowered for a moment. He's not wrong. That ambush was hell. I don't forget things like that. I never have. Whispers rippled across the courtroom like distant thunder. Even the prosecutor looked unsure of his posture now, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. A man they had expected to treat as just. Another transient defendant had suddenly been cast in a light no one had anticipated. War hero, survivor, a man tied to the final words of the judge's own brother. Judge Royce removed her glasses and placed them gently on the bench in front of her. Her eyes were glassy and her voice came quieter this time. He said you shielded a medic during crossfire, pushed a wounded private into a ditch, and drove the last vehicle out despite being hit twice yourself. Daniel's fingers flexed, slightly. His gaze remained downcast. I did what needed to be done. A lot of men never came back. I was one of the lucky ones. You were injured? She asked, barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly. Shrapnel to the leg. Broke 2 ribs. Nothing compared to what others suffered. I just happened to be there at the right time. The courtroom was silent again, reverent now. What had started as a trespassing case was rapidly becoming something else entirely, something sacred. The judge continued. What happened after the war, Mr. Cole? Daniel hesitated for a long time before speaking. I came home, bounced around from job to job. Tried teaching JROTC at a high school. It did not last. Started working construction. Married for a few years. Lost her to cancer. After that, I just kind of drifted. His voice was low, but it carried weight. It was the sound of a man who had done everything that had ever been asked of him, and still lost everything that mattered. Why were you arrested? She asked gently. Daniel's mouth twisted into a half-frown. It was raining. There was a church with an open porch. I sat under it for the night. A patrol came by, asked what I was doing there. I told them I was just waiting out the storm. They told me to move along. I guess I was tired. Argued a little. They called it obstruction and resisting. I did not hit anyone. Just refused to leave. He did not say this bitterly, nor with any resentment. It was just a fact. Life had moved on. Institutions had changed. But for people like Daniel, the gaps between honor and survival had become harder to cross. Judge Royce looked around the courtroom, then leaned forward. Do you know what happened to your service records? He sighed. A fire at the storage center in St. Louis. A lot of documents from my unit got lost or corrupted. I tried getting benefits, but without solid paperwork, everything was stalled. I just stopped trying. A murmur of disbelief moved through the gallery. The idea that a decorated veteran had been swallowed by bureaucratic neglect was not new. But seeing it unfold in real time was something else entirely. The prosecutor stood slowly. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to motion for a dismissal. Everyone turned toward him. Even Daniel looked surprised. The prosecutor cleared his throat. This man was arrested for loitering and obstruction, but given what we've just learned, his service record, his injuries, his personal losses, it's not in the public interest to pursue charges against him. He's not a criminal. He's a forgotten soldier. Judge Royce gave a small, solemn nod. Motion granted. All charges against Sergeant Daniel Cole are hereby dismissed. The words fell like a benediction, but she was not done. She looked directly at Daniel, her voice trembling with sincerity. You should not be in a courtroom, Sergeant. You should be honored in one. He shifted slightly in his seat, visibly uncomfortable with the praise. I'm not looking for anything, Your Honor. I just wanted to be dry for the night. No, she replied softly. You were just doing your job. And you have done it with more integrity than most men I have seen in this room. Then she stood, slowly, deliberately. The courtroom followed her lead, first the attorneys, then the bailiff, then everyone seated in the gallery. A collective recognition swept through them, powerful and undeniable. For a moment, no one saw a defendant. They saw a man who had once stood between life and death for people he barely knew, who had lived a life built on sacrifice and who had asked for nothing in return. Court is adjourned, she said. Then she stepped down from the bench, not toward the exit, but toward Daniel. He looked up, puzzled. I don't expect you to remember, she said, her voice shaking slightly, but I was the one who received that final letter. I was the girl who read about you. You were a name in a folded paper that I cried over for years. Daniel's face changed, not with pride, but with quiet recognition. Then I'm sorry, he said gently. She reached out and shook his hand. Don't be. You gave my brother courage when he needed it most. He said you were the bravest man he ever met. He could not speak. He just nodded, lips pressed tight. And then something unexpected happened. People in the gallery began to applaud. It started quietly, 1, 2, then more. A hesitant wave of clapping that grew in strength, not because anyone told them to, but because they needed to. The applause was not loud or raucous. It was measured, respectful, almost sacred. It was for him. Daniel stood still, awkward, unsure what to do. But Judge Royce remained beside him, her hand still resting on his arm. You're not forgotten anymore, Sergeant Cole, she whispered. The applause continued, and for the first time in decades, Daniel Cole no longer felt invisible. He felt remembered. He felt home. The morning after his charges were dropped, Daniel awoke to something he had not felt in years. Stillness. Not the oppressive kind that haunted the nights he had spent on frozen park benches or beneath overpasses, but a peaceful stillness. Quiet soaked in clean linen, soft light, and the absence of fear. The cot beneath him was firm but not cruel. His hands were clean, the hospital gown crisp. The hum of the air vents and occasional distant footsteps from the hallway reminded him he was somewhere safe. The Veteran Recovery Center was not a palace, but it was a palace to a man who had lived through decades of being ignored. News of what had unfolded in Judge Royce's courtroom had traveled fast. A local reporter, who had been present during the trial, posted a short video clip of the courtroom's final moments. Judge Royce stepping down, shaking Daniel's hand, and the quiet applause that followed. That video, raw and unfiltered, was picked up by larger outlets within hours. By the following morning, Daniel Cole's name was being discussed across the country. The headlines read like tributes. Veteran forgotten by system finds justice in court. Sergeant Cole, from park bench to national hero. Judge stands for soldier she never forgot. Each retelling emphasized a different angle. His service, his fall through the cracks, his honorable silence. But all centered on the same truth. Daniel Cole was not invisible anymore. At the recovery center, staff members treated him with a gentle reverence. Nurses referred to him as Sergeant Cole, even though he repeatedly asked them just to call him Daniel. Volunteers arrived daily to drop off cards, handmade blankets, or letters from people across the country. Messages poured in. "You are a hero. My grandfather served with someone just like you. You reminded me that sacrifice should never be forgotten." He received letters from children who had watched the courtroom clip in school, from veterans who recognized the Echo Company patch in old photos, and from people who had never served, but saw in Daniel something their country had almost lost. Days after the news broke, a senator from his state arrived in person. She wore a navy blue suit and no camera crew, only a solemn expression and a folder under her arm. "Mr. Cole," she said gently, "we failed you, on every level, but I intend to make that right." The senator sat with Daniel for almost an hour. She asked about his lost documents, about the VA applications that had gone unanswered, about the lack of mental health care and housing support. When she left, she promised 3 things. His records would be fully reviewed and reconstructed, with the help of surviving members of Echo Company. His name would be submitted for official military honors review, and legislation would be introduced to ensure no veteran ever fell through the cracks the way he had. Within a week, donations from across the country funded a full scholarship fund in his name for homeless veterans returning to school. An anonymous donor covered the cost of his medical treatments. A tech CEO pledged to build a long-term transitional housing program using Daniel's story as the foundation. Another group, a team of veterans who had been following his story from Idaho, drove across the country just to shake his hand. And Daniel, though moved by all of it, remained the same quiet man who had sat in that courtroom, not seeking recognition, only shelter from the storm. He did not ask for praise. He spent most of his days in physical therapy or reading old books in the center's library. His favorite spot was a small bench in the garden behind the facility where the sun filtered through the trees just right. One afternoon, a nurse named Melanie sat beside him. She had been assigned to his care from day one. Her father had served in Korea, and she carried the quiet dignity of someone who respected sacrifice without ever needing it explained. "Do you ever wish things had turned out differently?" she asked him gently as she checked his blood pressure. He looked out across the garden, eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once. "Not really. I did what I had to do. I lost people I cared about, but they would have done the same for me." Melanie nodded. "You've made an entire country stop and remember what matters." Daniel smiled faintly. "Only thing I regret is that my brothers are not here to see it. The ones who never made it back. They should have seen this day." He shifted slightly, wincing as he adjusted his leg. "I used to think we were forgotten. That all the things we did, all the blood, the sand, the tears, it was all buried. But maybe that was never true. Maybe people just needed to be reminded." His voice dropped, but Melanie heard every word. "We weren't forgotten. Not really. We were just waiting to be remembered." Outside the gates of the center, people gathered each day, not to protest, not to demand, but to honor. Veterans in uniform stood in silent salute. High school students brought drawings. A former Marine from Kentucky drove 500 miles just to shake Daniel's hand, then left without saying another word. One evening, a small ceremony was held in the center's courtyard. Judge Royce had returned, this time as a guest, not a judicial officer. She stood at the podium with a folded American flag and a plaque from the local Veterans Affairs office, officially naming one of their new programs after Daniel Cole. A choir of local students sang "America the Beautiful." Veterans from multiple wars stood with hands over their hearts. When Daniel was brought out, now dressed in a clean suit that volunteers had helped him purchase, the entire crowd rose to their feet. Not with applause, but in silence. Shoulders back, heads high, hands over hearts. It was a standing ovation unlike any other. Not loud, not chaotic, but powerful. He took the stage, nervously clutching the microphone. "I never expected this," he began, his voice steady but low. "I never asked for it. I only wanted a dry place to sleep." He looked around the crowd. "But what I found was something I thought I had lost. Honor. Not the kind pinned on your chest, but the kind that lives in other people's hearts when they remember you." He paused, his breath catching slightly. "I accept this not for me, but for the men who died in silence, for the ones who will never know they were remembered." And then he stepped back, folding his hands in front of him, eyes misted but unbroken. That night, the story of Daniel Cole was featured on every national broadcast, not as a sad tale of homelessness or injustice, but as a reminder of resilience, of dignity, of a nation's capacity to forget and then to remember. Weeks later, Daniel was offered a full-time position as a veterans advocate. He would speak to legislators, help process lost service claims, and mentor younger veterans trying to re-enter civilian life. The center gave him a private room. The city awarded him the key to its streets, and still he kept his mornings quiet. Coffee in the courtyard, a paperback novel in his lap, birds fluttering nearby. When people asked what changed, he would simply say, "They saw me." Daniel Cole did not need parades or medals. He had spent his life protecting others, expecting nothing in return. But in the end, the world gave him something far greater. Remembrance, not of war but of worth, and in that, he found peace.